The Cold Spring Canyon, nestled above the sun-soaked hills of Santa Barbara, hides a dark and dangerous secret. By day, it lures hikers with its jagged rocks and wild beauty, offering a stunning yet treacherous landscape. But as dusk settles, the canyon transforms, its winding paths become shadows, and the once inviting terrain turns into a deadly maze, capable of swallowing anyone who dares venture too far. In October 2006, two young souls, Rachel Moore and Conrad West, set out on what would be their final journey into this unforgiving canyon. Rachel, a 4-year-old botany student, and Conrad, a 7-year-old architect, shared a love for hiking. For them, the canyon was a haven, a place where they could explore both nature and each other's dreams. Their weekend hike was meant to be a simple escape, an adventure to discover rare plants and enjoy the fresh air. But as October 9th rolled in, both failed to show up for their commitments. Their families, initially thinking they'd extended their trip, soon realized something was terribly wrong. The canyon had swallowed their secret, leaving only unanswered questions in its silence. The search for Rachel Moore and Conrad West was nothing short of desperate. With the couple's disappearance becoming a chilling mystery, the authorities launched an extensive search effort in the weeks that followed. Teams of volunteers, rescue workers, and local law enforcement officers were deployed to scour every inch of Cold Spring Canyon. Helicopters flew overhead, their rotors slicing through the silence as they searched from the skies. On the ground, a sea of searchers traversed the rugged terrain, calling out for the missing pair, hoping for a sign, any sign that they were still out there. The hope was that, by sheer determination, the couple might somehow be found alive, hidden somewhere in the unforgiving wilderness. However, Cold Spring Canyon proved to be an unforgiving adversary. The land, with its deep crevices and steep slopes, offered little assistance to the searchers. The canyon was no well-marked, easy-to-navigate hiking path. It was a labyrinth of jagged rocks, thick brush, and narrow gorges that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. Every corner held its own danger, and the chance of stumbling upon the couple's whereabouts in such a vast, wild area seemed slim. The volunteers pushed forward, but the harsh terrain slowed their progress at every turn. The challenges were immense. The canyon's steep, rocky cliffs posed a constant threat to the searchers. The narrow ledges were treacherous, and many parts of the canyon were too deep or too dangerous for rescue teams to access. The dense undergrowth made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead, and the rocky ground had a way of concealing the smallest clue, making the search all the more difficult. Even the trained dogs, their noses sharp and their instincts keen, struggled in the dense thickets of the canyon. The scent trail was quickly lost, and soon there was nothing left to follow but the echo of the searchers' calls. Despite all the resources and manpower thrown into the search, no trace of Rachel or Conrad was ever found. No footprints, no gear, not even a single piece of clothing. It was as though the canyon had swallowed them whole, leaving no trace behind. The searchers' hopes dwindled with each passing day, as the sheer scale of the canyon's vastness began to make it clear that the couple had somehow vanished completely. The days turned into weeks, and soon the official search was called off. There were simply no new leads to follow, no signs to cling to. As time went on, Rachel and Conrad's disappearance gradually faded from the public eye. The posters that had once covered telephone poles and storefronts throughout California were taken down, one by one. The news cycle moved on to the next story, and soon the mystery of the young couple's fate became nothing more than a whispered legend among locals. Their story, once a source of public intrigue, was now relegated to the annals of forgotten mysteries, slowly slipping from the collective memory. The official investigation was eventually closed, with no further developments to report. For their families, the pain of uncertainty became their constant companion, the unanswered questions lingering like a shadow that refused to leave. What had started as a frantic search for answers became a haunting silence, the canyon's secrets remaining locked away, its truth buried deep within the rock. It was a hot day in July 2023 when three experienced rock climbers, Leo, Jenna, and Marcus, set out on their usual weekend adventure. They weren't interested in the well-trodden paths or popular climbing routes. Instead, they had their eyes set on an untouched rock face deep within Cold Spring Canyon, one that had never been explored, a place off the beaten track where they could make their own mark. The trio, accustomed to pushing the limits, had come prepared for a challenging ascent. As they scaled the sheer rock face, the canyon spread out below them like a vast, untamed map, its contours stretching across the horizon. They were high up by noon, focusing on their climb, carefully maneuvering along narrow ledges and inspecting cracks in the rock for secure placements. But as Leo led the way, scanning the face for a safe spot to set up the next anchor point, something caught his eye. A narrow vertical crack in the rock to his right seemed out of place, almost as though it had been waiting for them to discover it. It was a tight squeeze, far too narrow for a person to pass through, but deep enough that Leo's curiosity piqued. As he leaned closer, something unusual caught his eye. A faint piece of fabric wedged within the crack. At first, Leo thought it was just debris, some trash left by an earlier hiker. But something about it didn't sit right. The fabric, although faded and dirty, was too neatly tucked away, and the location seemed far too remote for it to have simply fallen there. He called out to his climbing partners, "Hey, look, it's like someone left some rubbish here." But Jenna, with her usual sharp eye for the environment, felt uneasy. "It doesn't feel right," she said, staring down at the spot. "Who would put a jacket all the way down there?" Leo's curiosity got the better of him. Ignoring his growing sense of discomfort, he decided to descend into the crack to investigate. Securing himself with a rope, he carefully climbed down, deeper into the shadowy crevice. The air grew colder as he descended, the narrow gap between the rock faces closing in on him. His headlamp flickered as the darkness intensified, casting eerie shadows on the jagged walls around him. As he got lower, he saw more of the fabric, a piece of clothing, perhaps a jacket, tucked tightly against the rock. Then, as his light flicked across the dark crevice, he froze. There, in the darkness, were two human skeletons, still sitting close together, as if they had been trying to embrace for warmth in their final moments. Their remains, crushed against the rock, seemed almost surreal in the silence of the canyon. The fabric, now identified as the remnants of jackets, clung to their bones, decayed but unmistakable. Leo's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. He wasn't looking at a tragic accident. He was looking at something far more disturbing. The two bodies were not just abandoned, they were hidden, concealed deep within the rock. His breath caught in his throat as he turned to his climbing partners, his voice barely a whisper. "Jenna, Marcus, you need to call 999. There are two people here. They've been here for a long time." Shaken, Leo climbed back up to the ledge, his hands trembling as he secured himself. Marcus immediately grabbed the radio, calling emergency services to report the grim discovery. The response was swift. The authorities were alerted, and soon helicopters were dispatched to the scene. The climbers, still in shock, watched as the emergency recovery team prepared to retrieve the bodies. It was no easy task. The cliff was steep, and the bodies were trapped deep within the narrow crevice. Professional rescue teams arrived, equipped with the necessary ropes and pulleys, and began the painstaking process of recovering the remains. As they carefully worked to extract the bodies, the reality of what they had discovered began to sink in. The remains of Rachel and Conrad, once lost to the wilderness, were now being brought back to the surface after 17 long years. The operation was delicate, requiring precise coordination between the rescuers. Every bone, every fragment of decayed clothing was carefully packed and lifted out of the crevice, a task that took hours. It was a painstakingly slow process, but eventually the bodies were brought up, one by one, and placed into body bags to be flown by helicopter to the morgue. What had begun as a routine climb turned into a chilling discovery that would unravel a mystery years in the making. The canyon, which had swallowed Rachel and Conrad whole, had finally revealed its secrets. The bodies were confirmed to be those of the missing couple, and with their discovery, the door was open to the investigation that would reveal the truth about their untimely deaths, a truth that had been buried in the rocks for nearly 2 decades. The discovery of Rachel Moore and Conrad West's remains marked the beginning of a new chapter in a case that had remained unsolved for 17 years. With the bodies now recovered, the next step was to uncover the truth of their untimely deaths. The forensic investigation that followed would change the course of the entire case and reveal the shocking reality that their deaths were not the result of a tragic accident, but of cold-blooded murder. At first, the bodies showed little sign of decomposition, which was unusual given the length of time they had been in the canyon. The dry, arid conditions had, however, preserved them in a way that gave forensic experts a unique opportunity to examine every detail. The bones of Rachel and Conrad were carefully studied, and what the experts found was chilling. Both victims showed signs of violent death, with no fractures or broken bones that might have indicated a fall or an accident. Instead, forensic specialists identified a disturbing set of injuries, microscopic scratches, and abrasions on their necks and broken hyoid bones. These injuries pointed to one horrifying possibility: strangulation. As the pathologist worked through the findings, it became clear that the couple had not died due to a mishap on the canyon's treacherous paths, as had originally been feared. The lack of any physical trauma that would suggest a fall, combined with the clear signs of strangulation, led the experts to believe that Rachel and Conrad had been deliberately murdered. This revelation sent a shiver down the spine of everyone involved in the investigation. What had initially seemed like an innocent hiking trip had turned into a dark and twisted crime. The discovery of the cause of death opened up an entirely new set of questions. Had the couple been attacked by a random stranger, or was this a targeted crime? The evidence from the scene suggested the latter. Alongside the bodies, several key pieces of evidence were found: a rope that appeared to have been used in the strangulation, a torn backpack strap, and the absence of their personal belongings, wallets, phones, cameras, and even their sleeping bags pointed to a robbery. The killer had not just killed them, he had taken everything of value and left their bodies to rot in the canyon. The scene was carefully analyzed, and each detail offered more insight into the nature of the crime. The rope found near the bodies matched a standard climbing rope, similar to the type commonly used by climbers. This was crucial because it indicated that the killer was likely someone familiar with the canyon's landscape, someone who had the knowledge and skill to maneuver through the harsh terrain without being detected. The fact that no other hikers had reported anything unusual in the area made it clear that the killer had planned this attack carefully, choosing a location that would be difficult for anyone else to reach. Despite the promising clues, the identity of the killer remained elusive. Investigators struggled to piece together a profile of the perpetrator. The rope and the fact that the killer had concealed the bodies deep within the canyon suggested that the person was experienced with the terrain, possibly a local resident or someone who spent a lot of time in the area. But the absence of any direct evidence linking a suspect to the crime left investigators in a state of uncertainty. The physical evidence, while telling, was circumstantial at best. The investigation, despite its promising start, stalled once more. Forensic experts worked tirelessly, conducting further tests, analyzing the rope, and even attempting to extract DNA from the crime scene. But despite all their efforts, the one crucial piece of evidence that could have led them to the killer was missing. No DNA traces were found on the rope or the other evidence left behind. It was as though the killer had anticipated the investigation and gone to great lengths to cover his tracks, leaving behind only the faintest of clues. In the weeks that followed, the investigation took a step back, with no new leads emerging. The lack of concrete evidence made it difficult to pursue any suspects. Despite the breakthrough in identifying the cause of death and gathering key evidence, the identity of the killer remained a mystery. The forensic investigation had raised more questions than it had answered, and the case seemed to have hit another dead end. As the days turned into weeks, the search for the killer grew colder. With no witnesses, no solid leads, and no suspects, the investigators were left to ponder a chilling reality. The person responsible for Rachel and Conrad's deaths was still out there, walking free. The killer's identity remained shrouded in secrecy, just as the canyon had kept its grim secret for so many years. The question on everyone's mind was whether justice would ever be served, or if the mystery would remain unsolved forever. As the investigation continued, the authorities began to piece together a psychological profile of the killer. With the physical evidence suggesting that the murders were deliberate, and with the knowledge that Rachel and Conrad had been attacked in a remote part of the canyon, investigators focused on the idea that the perpetrator was likely someone local or someone with intimate knowledge of the area. The canyon was no place for a casual passerby to stumble upon such a secluded spot. It required knowledge of the terrain, an understanding of its many narrow crevices and hidden routes. This led them to consider that the killer might have been a regular in the canyon, possibly a climber or a park worker, someone who was comfortable in such a hostile environment. The more they analyzed the evidence, the clearer it became that the killer had planned the crime with chilling precision. The location, the concealment of the bodies, and the use of climbing equipment pointed to someone with considerable skill and experience. This idea suggested a local, someone who could easily navigate the rugged landscape and knew exactly where to hide the bodies, out of sight of any casual hiker or rescuer. The lack of evidence tying a specific individual to the crime, however, meant that the investigators were forced to rely on psychological profiling to guide them. The evidence also pointed to a potential motive that seemed all too familiar in many true crime cases: robbery. The fact that Rachel and Conrad's valuables, wallets, phones, cameras were taken after their deaths strongly indicated that the killer had a financial motive. But it wasn't just a case of opportunistic theft. The way the killer had staged the crime, dragging the bodies into a remote crack in the rock, hiding them from view, suggested a more calculated and purposeful intent. This wasn't a crime of passion, but rather a cold, calculated act driven by something more sinister. The investigators began to theorize that the killer might have been motivated by the thought of quick, easy pickings. Rachel and Conrad had no reason to suspect anyone would harm them during their weekend hike. They were not confronting a known adversary. The killer, however, saw an opportunity in the isolation of the canyon, knowing that no one would come to their aid once they entered. The couple's backpacks were likely packed with hiking essentials, including cameras and perhaps money. It seemed that the murderer was looking to rob them, possibly targeting those who appeared vulnerable, making the most of their isolation. But despite all the clues, the investigation stagnated. With no direct witnesses and the evidence pointing to a local who had meticulously planned the crime, the authorities found themselves struggling to narrow down suspects. The forensic tests had yielded no DNA traces, and the psychological profile of the killer was more a theory than a concrete lead. Despite their best efforts, the investigation seemed to reach a frustrating dead end. They had no physical evidence linking a suspect to the crime scene, and there was no way of tracing who might have used the rope or left the other items behind. As the weeks turned into months, the investigators' hopes began to dwindle. The killer, once an ominous figure in the shadows, remained elusive. They had a theory, a profile, and even a motive, but none of these were enough to lead them to an arrest. Cold Spring Canyon, which had hidden its secrets for so long, had not given up its final revelation. The investigation had stalled, leaving Rachel and Conrad's families in the agonizing limbo of not knowing what truly happened to their loved ones, or, more terrifyingly, who was responsible for their deaths. The case that had once seemed full of promise now seemed to be fading into the background, a forgotten mystery that still had no answers. The discovery of Rachel and Conrad's remains brought a bittersweet closure to their families. After 17 long years of uncertainty, their loved ones were finally able to give them the dignity of a proper burial. Yet, this closure was far from complete. While the pain of not knowing what had happened to them had been alleviated, there remained a haunting question that would never leave their minds: who was responsible for their deaths? The investigation into the couple's murder, though thorough, had failed to produce any solid leads, leaving the killer still at large. As the years passed, the mystery of Rachel and Conrad's tragic end seemed destined to remain unsolved. The authorities were no closer to uncovering the identity of the killer, and the fear that they might never face justice hung heavy in the air. Would the murderer ever be found? Would the families ever see true justice for the senseless deaths of two young, vibrant lives? The chilling thought that the killer might still be walking free, unaffected by the pain they had caused, was a difficult one for those left behind to bear. As we reflect on this haunting case, we are reminded of the fragility of life and the darkness that can sometimes lie beneath the surface of seemingly innocent adventures. The mystery of Rachel and Conrad is one that will likely linger in the shadows, with no clear answers in sight. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true crime mysteries and unsolved cases. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the killer will ever be caught? Let us know what you think.